The moment you hear your own voice from someone you've never met is the moment your past stops being buried. The ballroom glowed in gold and crystal, every table filled, every camera angled toward the stage where Ethan Cole stood like he owned the night, because he did. The man who built an empire out of precision and control, the face of Cole Dynamics, the voice that could move markets with a sentence. And tonight that voice carried smoothly across the room as he spoke about leadership, about inclusion, about building a future where everyone had a place. His words polished, measured, rehearsed to perfection while the audience nodded. Investors leaned in, and flashes from phones and cameras flickered like quiet lightning across the sea of black tuxedos and silk gowns. Everything exactly as it should be. Every detail aligned with the image he had spent years crafting. Untouchable, unshaken, complete, until the music shifted, subtle at first, just a cue in the background that most didn't notice. But the event coordinator near the stage straightened, the MC adjusted her earpiece, and the giant screen behind Ethan faded to black, pulling the room into a brief, curious silence as Ethan stepped back half a pace, brows tightening just slightly. Not confusion, not yet, just a disruption, a fraction of a second where control slipped. Then the MC's voice came, bright, composed, introducing a special opening guest, a phrase that hadn't been on the official program, a detail that hadn't crossed Ethan's desk. And that alone was enough to shift something in his chest, because nothing happened at his events without his approval. Nothing. And yet the spotlight moved, drifting away from him, cutting across the stage until it landed on a small figure emerging from the wings, a boy, no more than 6 or 7, dressed in a neat charcoal suit that fit him just a little too perfectly, as if someone had made sure every inch of him belonged in that room. His posture straight, his steps calm, not hesitant, not overwhelmed by the scale of the space or the weight of the eyes now turning toward him, and the murmurs began, soft, confused, curious, while Ethan's gaze locked onto the child, searching, calculating, trying to place what didn't make sense, because this wasn't part of the plan. And yet the boy walked to the center of the stage, took the microphone with steady hands, and for a brief second the entire room held its breath, waiting for something small, something expected, a rehearsed line, a child's voice, light and uncertain. But when he spoke, the air shifted, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, because the voice that came through the speakers wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't even similar. It was exact, the same tone, the same cadence, the same controlled rhythm that Ethan had spent years hearing in boardrooms and recordings and interviews. His own voice, echoing back at him from a child standing under his spotlight. And the effect was immediate. Glasses paused mid-air, conversations died mid-whisper, cameras tilted, zoomed, locked in as if instinctively recognizing something impossible unfolding in real time. And Ethan didn't move, not at first, his body still, his expression held together by years of discipline. But his eyes gave him away, narrowing just slightly, then widening a fraction as the boy continued speaking, each word landing heavier than the last, not because of what was being said, but because of how it sounded, because it sounded like him, perfectly, undeniably him, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of the night, beneath the applause and the elegance and the illusion of control, something old and unresolved began to rise, a memory without shape, a moment he had dismissed, a face he hadn't thought about in years. And just as the realization threatened to take form, the boy turned his head slightly, looking past the crowd, past the lights, toward a figure standing at the edge of the room, and Ethan followed that gaze without thinking, his eyes cutting through the audience until they landed on her. And in that instant, the noise of the room disappeared, leaving only the quiet weight of recognition pressing down on his chest. The distance between them did not look far, maybe 40 feet across polished marble and candlelit tables, but to Ethan it felt like years collapsing into a single breath. Because Amara Lewis stood exactly as he remembered, and yet completely different, her posture calm, her presence steady, not demanding attention but holding it without effort, her dark dress simple against the sea of glittering gowns, her gaze fixed on him with a quiet certainty that did not ask for recognition and did not need permission to exist in that room. And the moment their eyes met, something in Ethan's chest tightened in a way no boardroom pressure ever had. No negotiation, no risk, no billion-dollar deal had ever reached this place beneath his control, because this was not strategy, this was memory, and memory did not obey him. On the stage, the boy continued speaking, his voice carrying through the speakers with that same measured cadence, the same pauses Ethan had perfected over years of public appearances, the same slight drop at the end of each sentence. And now the audience was no longer confused. They were watching, studying, comparing, heads turning between the man who built the empire and the child who sounded like he had inherited it. Whispers growing sharper, phones lifting higher, capturing every second, because something undeniable was unfolding and no one wanted to miss it. Ethan took a step forward without realizing it, his body moving before his thoughts could catch up, his hand lowering slowly from his side, as if reaching for something that was not there. And in that fragile space between certainty and disbelief, the past began to surface with brutal clarity. A conference room years ago, too bright, too cold, a line of interns standing along the wall, waiting to be acknowledged, and among them a quiet presence, a woman who did not speak unless asked, who carried her notes with precision, who did her work without drawing attention. And Ethan remembered the moment, not because it mattered to him then, but because it returned now with unbearable weight. The offhand comment, the dismissive tone, the way the room had shifted with quiet laughter that followed his lead, the way he had reduced her to a moment that meant nothing to him and everything to her, and he had walked away from it, because men like him always did, because power allowed him to forget. But standing there now, watching the child on stage, hearing his own voice reflected back at him, forgetting was no longer an option. The boy paused, his small hand adjusting the microphone slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm that did not belong to someone his age. And then he looked again toward Amara, not seeking approval, not searching for reassurance, just acknowledging her presence like it had always been his anchor. And that simple exchange struck Ethan harder than anything else, because it was not staged, it was not for the audience, it was real, and reality did not bend to his control. The applause began slowly, uncertain at first, then building as people responded not just to the performance, but to the tension they could feel without understanding. And through it all, Amara did not move. She did not smile. She did not step forward. She simply stood there, grounded, as if she had already lived this moment long before it arrived. And Ethan finally understood that this night, this event, this carefully constructed image of success, had never truly been his to command, because the truth had entered the room without announcement, without permission, carried in the voice of a child who did not need to prove anything. And as the sound of applause filled the space, Ethan's world narrowed to one question he could no longer ignore, not how this was possible, but how he had ever believed it would stay hidden. The applause did not feel like celebration. It felt like pressure building in a room that had just realized it was witnessing something it could not explain, and Ethan stood there as the sound wrapped around him, loud but distant, because his focus had narrowed to two people, the boy on the stage and the woman across the room, and everything else became background noise, irrelevant, disposable, the way he had once treated moments that did not serve his agenda. But this was different. This was not something he could dismiss, not something he could delegate or control with a decision made behind closed doors, because this was happening in front of everyone, under lights he had chosen, inside a narrative he had written for himself. And now it was shifting without his consent. The boy finished his speech with a composure that did not belong to his age, lowering the microphone slightly as the final words settled into the air, and for a brief second there was silence again, not empty this time, but heavy, as if the room itself was waiting for something more, for an explanation, for a reaction, for the man they all came to see to reclaim the moment. But Ethan did not step forward. He did not move to take back the stage, because something in him understood that the stage no longer belonged to him. The boy turned slightly, his small hand adjusting his jacket with a simple, practiced motion, and then he stepped away from the microphone, walking toward the edge of the platform where a staff member instinctively moved to guide him. But before that hand could reach him, another presence shifted. Amara stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just one step, enough to meet him as he came down, and the way the boy moved toward her was immediate, natural, without hesitation, as if every path he had ever taken led back to her. And she did not kneel, did not draw attention. She simply placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, grounding him, steady. And in that small gesture the room saw something more powerful than any announcement, something that did not need explanation, connection, certainty, truth. Ethan felt it like a physical weight pressing against his chest, because no report, no document, no carefully prepared statement could replicate what was standing in front of him. And for the first time in years, he did not have the advantage of information. He did not know what had been planned. He did not know how long this had been in motion. He did not know why now. And that absence of knowledge unsettled him more than anything else. He took another step forward, this time aware of it, his shoes echoing faintly against the marble as nearby guests shifted to give him space, not out of respect, but out of instinct, because attention had turned, not to the stage, not to the boy, but to him, waiting, watching, measuring, the same way he had once measured others. And as he moved closer, the details sharpened. The boy's profile, the shape of his jaw, the line of his brow, the subtle familiarity that had triggered recognition before his mind could process it. And now there was no denying it. No rational explanation that could soften what was becoming clear. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the reflection of the lights in the boy's eyes, close enough to feel the quiet steadiness coming from Amara without her saying a single word. And in that silence he realized something else. She was not surprised. She was not reacting. She was not waiting to see how he would respond. She had already moved beyond that need. Whatever this moment was, it was not for him to control or define. It was for him to face. And that difference stripped away the last layer of certainty he had been holding on to. His voice, when it finally came, was lower than usual, not projected, not shaped for an audience. Just a single question that carried more weight than any speech he had given that night. Who is he? And the way the words left him felt unfamiliar, not because of how they sounded, but because of what they revealed, that for once he was not presenting authority, he was asking for truth. And Amara looked at him, steady, composed, her expression unchanged, and for a moment it seemed like she might not answer at all, like silence would remain her final statement. But then her hand rested more firmly on the boy's shoulder, and the smallest shift in her gaze made it clear that the answer had never been hidden, only ignored. And the room, still filled with people, still lit with gold and glass, faded again into the background as the truth stood between them, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but immediate and impossible to step away from. The question did not echo the way his speeches did. It did not carry authority or command. It settled into the space between them like something fragile, something that could not be taken back once released. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole felt the weight of waiting, not for a deal to close or a number to confirm, but for an answer he could not control. And Amara did not rush to give it. She did not fill the silence to ease the discomfort spreading through the room. She let it exist, let it stretch just long enough for everyone watching to feel that this moment did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to truth. Her hand remained steady on the boy's shoulder, her posture unchanged, her gaze fixed on Ethan with a calm that was not cold but certain. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, because the room had already quieted itself for her. His name is Noah, she said, each word measured, clear, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any dramatic reveal, because she was not introducing a concept. She was naming a person. And then she paused, not for effect, but because there was nothing rushed about her truth. He is my son, she continued, and the distinction mattered, the ownership, the identity, the years that lived behind that statement, and Ethan felt it. The deliberate order of her words, what she chose to say first, and what she held back, and the absence, spoke as loudly as anything she could have added. He looked at the boy again, Noah, letting the name settle, letting the reality of him take shape beyond resemblance, beyond voice, beyond the undeniable reflection that had already shaken him. And in that moment, Ethan realized something else. The boy was not looking at him the way people usually did. There was no expectation, no recognition of status, no awareness of power, just a quiet curiosity, as if he was observing a stranger who happened to stand in his path. And that lack of connection cut deeper than accusation ever could, because it showed him exactly what had been lost without ever being claimed. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in restraint, the kind that comes when control begins to slip, but habit refuses to let it go completely. "And why is he here?" Ethan asked, the question coming out more carefully than the last, shaped now by the awareness that every word mattered, every tone would be heard, recorded, replayed, and Amara held his gaze, unshaken by the shift in his voice. "Because you invited him," she said simply, and the words moved through the crowd like a ripple, confusion flickering across faces. Because nothing about that statement made sense on the surface, and yet the certainty in her voice did not allow it to be dismissed. Ethan's brows drew together slightly, the first visible crack in the composed image he had maintained all night. "I did not," he replied, quieter now, more to himself than to her, because he would have remembered, he would have known. Nothing entered his world without passing through his control, and Amara gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of exactly that belief. "You did," she said again, her tone unchanged. "Every year, this event opens with a voice that represents the future you claim to build." She continued, and now there was a subtle shift, not in emotion, but in direction, as if she was guiding the truth into the space he had created for himself. "A voice chosen from those you say you are giving opportunities to," she added, and Ethan's mind moved quickly, connecting details, the selection process, the programs, the initiatives he funded, the systems he trusted others to manage, pieces he had approved without ever needing to look closely, because they served the image, they supported the narrative, and for the first time he saw the gap between what he believed he controlled and what actually existed within it. "Noah was selected," Amara said, her hand still steady, her presence still grounded. "Not because of you," she clarified, "but because of what you built without ever paying attention to, who it truly reached." And the words did not accuse, they did not attack, they revealed, and that made them harder to deflect, harder to ignore, because they were rooted in his own system, his own design. And as the realization settled, Ethan understood that this moment was not an interruption, it was a consequence, not sudden, but long overdue, standing in front of him in the form of a child who carried more truth in his voice than Ethan had allowed himself to hear in years. The words settled into Ethan's mind with a precision that felt almost surgical, not loud, not chaotic, but impossible to ignore, because they did not attack his authority, they exposed its limits. And for a man who had built everything on control, that difference mattered more than anything else. His gaze shifted again to Noah, studying him now not as a curiosity, not as an anomaly, but as a presence that had already altered the structure of the night. The boy stood quietly beside Amara, not seeking validation, not reacting to the tension that had wrapped itself around the room. His small shoulders relaxed, his expression calm, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had already been prepared for the weight of what was unfolding. And that realization struck Ethan with a different kind of force, because preparation meant intention, and intention meant this moment had not been created by chance. It had been allowed to happen. And for the first time he understood that the systems he trusted, the ones he believed he oversaw completely, had carried something forward without him ever noticing. The audience, once composed of investors and partners, had shifted into something else entirely, observers now not of success, but of truth being revealed in real time. Their silence no longer polite but attentive, waiting, measuring, recording, and Ethan could feel it, the subtle shift in power that did not announce itself but redefined everything in the room. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself, not to regain control, but to understand where it had gone, because it was no longer centered on him. It had moved, quietly but completely, to the space between Amara and the child. "You are saying," Ethan began, his voice measured again but stripped of its usual distance, "that this was never about me choosing him." And even as he spoke the words, he understood how they sounded, how they revealed the assumption he had always operated under, that every opportunity, every outcome, every moment of visibility existed because he allowed it. And Amara did not correct him immediately. She let the statement stand, let it reveal itself fully before she answered. "I am saying," she replied, her tone steady, "that he exists whether you choose to see him or not." And the clarity of that response cut through the room more cleanly than anything else that had been said, because it did not rely on accusation or emotion. It relied on fact, on presence, on something that could not be undone or rewritten. Ethan's expression tightened just slightly, not in rejection but in recognition, because the statement removed him from the center of the equation entirely. And that was not a position he was accustomed to occupying. His eyes lowered briefly, not out of defeat, but out of thought, processing, recalibrating. The way he did when faced with data that did not align with expectation. But this was not data. This was something else, something that did not fit into charts or projections, something that required acknowledgement before it could be understood. And when he looked back up, his gaze moved not to Amara, but to Noah, holding there for a moment longer than before, as if searching for something beyond resemblance, beyond voice, beyond the obvious connections that had already been established. "Does he know?" Ethan asked quietly, the question softer than anything he had said that night, and for a moment, it seemed as if the room itself leaned in to hear the answer, not because it needed to, but because it understood that this was no longer about spectacle. It was about truth in its most personal form. Amara did not hesitate this time. Her response immediate, grounded. "He knows who he is," she said, and the distinction in her words carried weight. She did not say what he knew about Ethan. She did not frame the answer around him at all, and that choice, that deliberate framing, made the meaning clear without needing explanation. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, understanding that whatever connection might exist biologically or historically, it had not been built in the ways he understood relationships. It had not been shaped by presence, by guidance, by time, and that absence could not be replaced in a moment, not in a room filled with witnesses, not under lights that revealed more than they concealed. The realization did not break him, but it shifted something fundamental. Because for the first time in a long time he was not evaluating an opportunity, he was confronting a consequence. And as the silence settled again, deeper now, heavier, the truth stood between them, unchanged, undeniable, waiting not for reaction, but for acknowledgement. The question did not leave the air immediately. It lingered, not as a challenge, but as something that demanded a different kind of response. And Ethan stood there with the unfamiliar weight of knowing that whatever came next would not be something he could shape or redirect, because this moment had already moved beyond him. And yet something inside him, something quieter than his usual instincts, pushed forward anyway, not out of control, but out of necessity. "What does he know?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but stripped of the certainty it once carried. And this time his eyes did not leave Noah, because the answer mattered in a way numbers never had. Amara did not look away, she did not soften, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, not emotion, not vulnerability, just acknowledgement that the question had finally reached the place it needed to be. "He knows his name, his work, his voice," she said, each word deliberate. "He knows the man people listen to." And the pause that followed was not hesitation, it was precision. "He does not know the man who forgot." And the sentence settled into Ethan with a clarity that did not allow interpretation, because it was not an accusation, it was a definition, and definitions were harder to escape than blame. The room reacted in silence, not out of politeness, but because the weight of what was being said had shifted the tone entirely. No longer a public spectacle, no longer a surprising moment in a carefully planned evening, but something more personal, more irreversible, and Ethan felt it. The difference between being seen and being understood, because for the first time he was being described in a way he had not chosen, and that realization carried its own kind of pressure. His jaw set slightly, not in defense, but in restraint, as he processed the words, as he traced them back through his memory, searching for the moment that had been reduced to something so small for him and so defining for her. And it came back clearer now, sharper than before. The meeting, the tone, the ease with which he had dismissed her presence, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, because he had never needed to consider the impact of his words, not when his world rewarded results and overlooked details. But now those details stood in front of him, undeniable, shaped into something that carried his own reflection. "I did not know," Ethan said quietly, the statement not offered as a defense, but as a fact, and even as he spoke it he understood how little it mattered. Because ignorance did not erase consequence, It only delayed recognition. Amara nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of that truth. You did not look, she replied, her voice calm, steady. There is a difference, and that distinction, simple as it was, shifted the weight of everything that had been said, because it removed chance from the equation and replaced it with choice. And Ethan felt that, felt the implication settle deeper than anything before it, because it suggested that what he had considered absence was in fact something he had allowed, something he had overlooked because it did not demand his attention, and now it did. Now it stood in front of him with a voice he could not ignore, with a presence that mirrored his own in ways that went beyond coincidence. Noah shifted slightly beside Amara, not in discomfort, but in awareness, his gaze moving between the two adults with a quiet curiosity that remained untouched by the tension surrounding them. And for a brief moment, Ethan saw himself reflected there, not in authority, not in power, but in possibility, the version of himself that had not been shaped by distance, by omission, by choices made without thought. And that realization carried a different kind of weight. Not regret exactly, but recognition of what had been left unformed, unclaimed, and as the silence returned once more, deeper now, more grounded, Ethan understood that this moment was not asking for explanation, it was asking for acknowledgement, not of what had happened tonight, but of what had been set in motion long before, and the difference between those two things was something he could no longer afford to ignore. The space between them no longer felt uncertain, it felt defined, shaped by everything that had already been said, and everything that had not needed to be spoken. And Ethan stood there with a clarity that did not come from understanding alone, but from being seen in a way he had never allowed before. The room remained quiet, not because it lacked reaction, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. Every guest now aware that they were no longer witnessing an event, but a reckoning that did not belong to spectacle. And in that stillness, Ethan realized something that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with image, something that existed outside of everything he had built. That acknowledgement could not be delegated, it could not be postponed, it could only be made or avoided, and avoiding it was no longer possible. His gaze moved once more to Noah, holding there longer this time, not searching, not analyzing, just seeing, taking in the presence of a child who stood without expectation, without demand, and somehow carried more truth in his stillness than any accusation could have delivered. Ethan drew a slow breath, the kind that came not from habit but from intention, and when he spoke again his voice did not reach for authority, it settled into honesty, quieter, but unmistakably present. I see him, he said, the words simple, stripped of anything unnecessary, and for a moment it seemed like the room itself shifted in response, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the subtle way that happens when something real replaces something constructed. Amara did not respond immediately. She watched him with the same calm steadiness she had held all night, not measuring the words for performance, not searching for weakness, just observing whether they carried weight. And in that pause Ethan understood that saying it was not enough, that recognition was not a statement, it was a responsibility, something that extended beyond this moment, beyond this room, beyond the eyes that were still fixed on them. I did not before, he continued, the admission coming without hesitation now, because there was nothing left to protect, but I do now. And the distinction mattered, not as an excuse, but as a line drawn between who he had been and who he was choosing to be in this moment. The audience remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It had settled into something more grounded, something that allowed the truth to exist without needing to react to it. Noah shifted slightly, his small hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, his gaze lifting again to meet Ethan's, and there was no judgment there, no resentment, just curiosity, as if he was waiting to understand what this moment meant, not in words, but in action. And Ethan felt that expectation without it ever being expressed, felt the quiet weight of being seen not as a figure, not as a name, but as a person whose next step would matter more than anything he could say. He took a small step forward, closing the remaining distance just enough to stand within reach, not crossing into something assumed, not forcing a connection that had not been built, but making space for it to exist. You spoke well, Ethan said to Noah, his tone even, respectful, not Exaggerated for effect, just genuine. And the boy nodded slightly, accepting the words without surprise, without hesitation, as if recognition did not define him, as if it was simply part of the moment. And that quiet acceptance shifted something again, because it showed Ethan that this was not about validation, it was about presence. Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting lightly on Noah's shoulder. But there was a subtle shift in her gaze, not approval, not relief, but acknowledgement that something real had been said, something that did not rely on the past, but did not ignore it either. And for the first time that night, the distance between them did not feel like separation. It felt like space, space that could be closed over time, or left as it was, but no longer defined by absence alone. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in low murmurs, cameras lowering, attention shifting, the moment did not disappear. It settled, becoming something that would not fade when the lights dimmed, because it had never belonged to the event. It belonged to the truth that had finally been spoken and the acknowledgement that had followed. And Ethan stood there knowing that whatever came next would not be decided in a single night, but in the choices that followed it, choices that could no longer be made without seeing who stood in front of him. The moment did not end when the voices in the room returned. It shifted, settling into something quieter, something that did not need attention to remain present. And Ethan stood there aware that the world around him had resumed its rhythm while something within him had not. Because acknowledgement was not an ending, it was a beginning, and beginnings required something more than words. They required movement, choice, consistency, things that could not be performed under a chandelier. And forgotten by morning, Noah remained beside Amara, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the weight of the moment had passed through him without leaving strain. And that steadiness made everything else feel more deliberate, more measured. Ethan glanced briefly toward the stage, the empty microphone still standing under the light, a reminder of where the shift had begun, and then back to the two people in front of him, the only place where it mattered now. This is not something that gets resolved tonight, Ethan said, not as a declaration, but as recognition, his tone grounded, no longer shaped for an audience, just directed toward them. And Amara inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he had finally reached a truth that did not require her to explain it. The difference between solving and facing, between controlling and accepting. And Ethan understood that distinction clearly now. But I will not pretend this did not happen, he added. And there was a quiet weight in the way he said it, not dramatic, not defensive, just firm, because pretense had been his refuge for a long time. And abandoning it required more than intention. It required decision. Noah looked up at him again, his expression thoughtful, not skeptical, not impressed, just present. And that presence carried its own kind of expectation, not of promises, but of consistency. Something that could only be proven over time. Ethan held that gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, not as a gesture of authority, but of recognition. And in that small exchange something shifted again, not visibly, not in a way the room could capture, but in a way that mattered more than any reaction. Amara's hand rested gently on Noah's shoulder, grounding him as she had from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her presence still defined by quiet strength rather than reaction. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had guided every word she had said. "We are not here to change your story," she said, her gaze steady. "We are here because it already exists." And the clarity of that statement left no room for interpretation, no space for negotiation, because it was not asking for inclusion. It was stating presence, and Ethan felt that fully, understood that whatever he chose to do next would not define their existence, only his place within it. The room had begun to move again. Conversations returning in low tones, staff adjusting the flow of the event, the structure attempting to reassert itself. But the moment had already marked it, had already redefined what it meant, and Ethan knew that no speech, no gesture, no attempt to redirect attention could erase what had been seen, because it had not been a spectacle, it had been truth, and truth did not fade when ignored. It waited, it remained. It shaped what came after. He stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space. understanding now that proximity did not equal connection. That connection would have to be built, slowly, deliberately, without assumption, and that realization grounded him more than anything else that had been said. Noah shifted his weight slightly, his small hand brushing against Amara's, as if confirming her presence, and she responded with the slightest squeeze, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, but one that carried years of consistency behind it, something Ethan could see but not yet share, and as he watched them, he understood that what stood in front of him was not a moment to be fixed. It was a reality to be respected, one that did not depend on him, one that had been built without him. And the only question that remained was whether he would choose to step into it with honesty or remain outside it with the illusion of control. And as the light from the chandelier softened slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor, the answer was no longer something he could delay. It was something he would have to live. The room never fully returned to what it had been before. Even as the music resumed and conversations carefully rebuilt themselves around the edges of the evening, because something quieter had taken hold beneath the surface, something that did not need volume to exist, and Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, not because he did not know where to go, but because for the first time in years he understood that moving forward required more than direction. It required intention, and intention was something he had spent most of his life applying to outcomes, not to people. His gaze followed Amara and Noah as they turned, not abruptly, not as an exit meant to draw attention, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined their presence from the beginning, their steps measured, steady, as if they were leaving a place that had never been meant to hold them, and the crowd parted instinctively, not out of command, but out of recognition, because even those who did not understand what had just unfolded could feel its weight, could sense that something real had passed through the room and altered it in ways that would not be undone by the continuation of the event. Noah walked beside Amara without looking back, his small hand brushing lightly against hers in a rhythm that spoke of familiarity, of years built outside the reach of everything Ethan had controlled, and that image remained with him, not as a loss, but as a truth, something that existed whether he acknowledged it or not, something that would continue beyond this night without needing his approval. And for a moment Ethan considered calling out, saying something more, something that might extend the moment, might bridge the space that still existed between them, but he did not because he lacked the words, but because he finally understood that this was not a moment to claim. It was a moment to respect, and respect sometimes meant allowing distance, allowing time, allowing something to exist without trying to shape it immediately into something else. His hands settled at his sides, relaxed in a way they had not been earlier, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it had changed, no longer something to resist, but something to carry forward. The stage behind him remained lit, the microphone still standing as a quiet reminder of where the shift had begun, and for the first time that night Ethan did not feel the need to return to it, did not feel the instinct to reclaim the center of the room, because he understood now that the center had moved, not physically, but in meaning, and reclaiming it would not restore what had been lost. It would only prove that he had learned nothing from what had just happened. The event would continue, the speeches would be given, the deals would be discussed, the image would attempt to rebuild itself. But Ethan knew that none of it would carry the same weight, not for him, not after this, because once truth entered a space, it did not leave quietly. It stayed, it reshaped everything around it. Even if no one spoke of it again. He turned slightly, his gaze lifting toward the far end of the ballroom where the doors had just closed behind Amara and Noah, the reflection of the chandelier lights fading against the glass as they stepped into a space that did not belong to this world of polished appearances. And in that reflection he saw something else, not a version of himself he could recognize, but a version he had yet to become, one defined not by control, but by choice, not by what he could command, but by what he was willing to face. And for the first time in a long time, that realization did not feel like a threat. It felt like direction, not immediate, not easy, but real. And as the music swelled again, filling the room with a familiar rhythm that tried to smooth over what had just occurred, Ethan did not move to match it. He stood still for one more moment, allowing the truth to settle fully, allowing it to take its place within him without resistance, because This time he would not forget. This time he would not look away. And that difference, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of something that could not be undone.